Well, Neri, you've been on the boat a few days now and joining us with your media group. And we've had an incredible amount of lectures and we've still got a few to go and they've really blown my mind. But I want to know, has this trip blown your mind? And what experience have you had, not just being with us on the sea and on the ocean and in the ocean?
So we've been here for 4 days, 1 more week to go together.
Yeah.
Being on the Dardanelles is really is really like finding balance in motion. You know, you're invited to live here without balance, in constant motion, on ground that is unbalanced and constantly moving. And it's very, very true also of the kind of experience that we've been having as individuals and as a group, being out of balance in a very, very productive and healthy way, and being given this kind of legitimacy to freely explore our ideas without necessarily coming up with a solution to an already existing problem, but really being allowed to be submerged in the ocean and in the hands of our own curiosities and sense of wonder. I have to say that, you know, when you read all the books, you know all the science, you've read all the information that one can read on corals and coral reefs and the state of the ocean, etc. There's nothing really like being there. And it completely shifts your perspective from a viewer or an observer that is exploring something that has already been explored by others, to an experience that is much more personal. And I think now, after having been here for 4 days, that it is only through personal experience that one can free one's sense of wonder and really think in a completely new way, and allow one to think in a completely new perspective about why we're here and what we're doing, why we're doing what we're doing, and what we're actually after.
Do you think that affects the studio work? Does it have an impact?
I think
or
so.
Or it's complementary more?
I think there is nothing like being in the real laboratory. That is nature. Nature is the real laboratory. We create all these experiments in a controlled environment at the MIT Media Lab, and all of a sudden we are here in the jungle, in the water, in the rain, really observing what we think we know from a completely different perspective. So yes, I think it makes a huge difference. I think it sets a triggers an emotional tone to the experience, and allows us to think freely about why we're here.
I have to bring James Weaver into the conversation here. You've brought him along. He's senior researcher at the Wyss Institute in Harvard and been studying corals 20 years, is it? I mean, something extraordinary. He's probably the most knowledgeable person scientifically on corals. We took him diving today. We did a refresher, and it's the first time he's ever experienced those corals in their natural habitat, and it blew his mind, and he was so thrilled and made my day to know that was, I couldn't believe he'd never actually been into the ocean before.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. I think especially for James, but also for all of us, that sense of the very idea of being part of nature, as opposed to, again, being outside of it and observing it from the outside, knowing it from the outside, contextualizes the project in a completely different way. Here we were under the water holding hands to find balance. We were, I think, about a few meters under the water, looking at corals and fish, losing our direction, but finding our friendship under the water. And that was such a special moment where we actually had to hold hands to find balance, and all of a sudden that research collaboration was charged with almost a kind of a sense of a survival mode. You know, we have to be together and support each other under the weight of the atmosphere to go on. And that's very, very special. It breaks the kind of boundaries between us academics or researchers or artists, creators, and here we are, only with the elements that we're so used to reading and exploring, and here we are needing to balance ourselves and hold hands and make, you know, signs to each other. I like to think of creation at large as a kind of a food chain. You know, we start with data or with information, and then we turn this data into knowledge, and the knowledge into experience, and experience into perception, and perception into the reinterpretation of data. And so we go through these cycles, and being on the Dardanelles really allows us to go through this whole food chain of what being a creator actually means. And that was a very, very special experience, being under the water, for the water, together.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned food chain, because when I was in the Galapagos, you realize that you're not in the shark's food chain, because they swim around you, they look at you, they come really close. But once you understand you're not part of their food chain, it's a different relationship. And it is really like, it's a hierarchy, it's true. James gave us a lecture yesterday about his study of corals and their structures. And I really had never, I've only seen corals in real life, you know, so I come from completely the opposite position. And I started to see how they are constructed and how rigorous and how mechanical even their structures are.
Yeah.
And obviously they're very robust. And what the fragile side of it is the life forms that occupy these skeletons, in fact. And he was showing us the skeletons mainly. But how does the study of these biological forms, or the structures that we saw in these reefs, alter our conception of what architecture is? In your case, I mean, you're working closely with him since a few months on this project, the Coral Pavilion. I mean, how does this influence your practice?
Oh, in so many ways. I could talk about this forever, Francesca. I think, in so many ways. First of all, corals are incredible in that they are the rainforests of the sea. They've been known by Darwin first and later by other explorers to be really the trees, the very fauna that breathes underwater and creates a habitat for the ecosystem under the ocean. What I've realized with corals is you cannot think of corals without thinking about the various species and classes of organisms that feed on them, and how they feed then on these organisms, and the kind of symbiotic relationships that you find between organisms and corals. So you think, you're trained to think of corals as this kind of organism that is defined by its morphological orders, or at least as an architect. I tend to look at corals as a kind of as a set of library of morphological orders, but actually it is part of a huge ecosystem, us being part of that ecosystem, and that's mostly the emotion that governs the kind of experience that I've had here. Mostly humbles me. It humbles me to be able to observe this entire ecosystem as a whole, and to consider myself as part of it as well. As architects, we are trained to create a sense of place for human beings, and that place carries some kind of symbolic value in certain buildings more than others, but of course it's also a shelter. But the shelter, especially in contemporary architecture, and more specifically in digital design practice, is more and more seen as a kind of signature architecture, as a piece that's special, that has some kind of special morphological features, and is set on the environment, is presented to the environment as is. Studying the coral reefs really allows the creator to think of architecture as part of the ecosystem. I like to think of it as a material ecology, the ecology of the artificial. And as we practice and create artificial products and buildings, things that are made of artificial, we're also contributing to that ecology, we're contributing to that symbiosis, we're contributing to the ecosystem, and we are part of that ecosystem. So the Coral Pavilion really invites this kind of perspective about design. Design is not about creating an object, you know, carte blanche kind of process, but really is about understanding the site, the environment, and integrating various elements of that environment into the project. If the project is successful, it carries some of the signature of the environment with it. If it's very successful, it can change the environment for the good. And that kind of integrative, ecosystematic view of the oceans is also informing our vision of this project as a whole.
But you've been looking at individual corals, and when you look at a reef, you have many of these different corals and different systems kind of joined together. And then some of it is dead, as we've seen, which is, I believe, is a natural process as well. And then you've got other ones that are sort of super vibrant. There are others that are providing shelter to fish. I mean, that sort of also, in my mind, represents a sort of urban planning in a certain way. So it goes beyond just design and really refined design, but actually how the whole reef also protects shorelines. And, you know, we've just been in the Trans-Amazonian Barrier Reef, which is the second biggest, and after the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. I mean, these are complete cities in a way. They're like total environments.
Yeah, they are cities of the underwater, of course. Yeah, actually, what's special about corals is that one can understand, and this is only after being on the boat actually that I'm starting to have these thoughts, are one of the most smallest creatures of the ocean, and yet one of the biggest creatures of the ocean, because you can see them from outer space.
Reefs.
You can see the reefs from outer space, and then you can go into the micro scale of the coral and understand how its structure is informed by that kind of scale. So corals really allow us to move from the individual polyp to the modular, the module that defines that system, to a colony of polyps, to a city, to kind of an urban setting of those corals and the interaction between them. And there, of course, they're acting as resonating chambers for the fish and the whole society of organisms around them. And if only our world could be, the human world could be modeled after these oceanic cities. Maybe
is that a challenge you could pick up?
Yeah.
Is that something, is that beyond sort of the architectural design and the research that you're doing?
Yeah, of course.
It is another science in a way.
Yeah, of course. I think we're creating not necessarily, or not only a building or a pavilion, but really an environment that would contain all of these thoughts and perceptions. Some of them are more scientific, some of them are perhaps more poetic, but they're all contained within this environment. Another big challenge for us is coming up with the processes by which to build the pavilion, which are no less challenging than the pavilion itself. And with corals as well, I mean, the very act of ossification and creating those modular systems under the water has everything to do with how the organism ends up looking and behaving. And so the environmental plasticity, its morphological features, its behavioral codes, are all part and parcel of the same system, and there are no ornamentations. Every detail has a function, and every detail is in place.
And but the whole design, obviously, of a reef is conducive to having water flowing through it. I mean, that's part of the whole, also the incredible process of photosynthesis that, you know, that generates all the oxygen that they create, and the algae that live within. So how would you bring that above ground, and how would you deal with the fact that you're actually in an aerial situation?
Yeah, there are several ways that I think that we'd like to correspond or respond to that challenge. The first is perhaps more of a poetic challenge, which is, you know, if we can't build a coral pavilion for the coral reefs, which is something that we've considered, and is still relevant, but if we're not building a pavilion for the coral reef, that is a structure that actually lives and behaves underwater, and we're building a pavilion on land, is there a way to, rather than bring the pavilion to the ocean, to bring the ocean to the pavilion? How does one bring the ocean into a pavilion? And if one does that kind of design become a representation of the world under the water, or does it actually become a productive machine that can inform our conception and perception of the underwater world? And better still, this machine can be used to perhaps to make more efficient that relationship. Perhaps we can scrape CO2 out of the air. Perhaps we can create a photosynthetic machine. Perhaps we can engineer a polyp. You know, what are the various challenges that we see here as, you know, both as artists but also as engineers and, God forbid, scientists that can actually use this project as a platform to explore this productive synergy with nature, for nature, and for the world.
You've already embarked on a project using life forms with the Silk Pavilion, and could you tell us a bit about that and how this has already started to inform this project? Because you're dealing with life matter and the reactions, or I don't know what do you call the movements of the silkworm? They're sort of automatic.
The
eight figure movement. I mean, how you incorporated that into the whole design process?
Yeah, sure. Well, our group has gone through an evolution also, a kind of an intellectual evolution, where we started with taking inspiration from nature, which is a very general term to say that, you know, that we've been looking to make productive our curiosity about nature. And it started as a kind of a more distant reinterpretation of natural forms, that is, taking natural phenomena and creating mathematical models that describe these natural phenomena, and then mapping these mathematical models on top of products or architectural forms, and then recreating them using other materials. So there were multiple levels of translation that started with nature and ended with culture, and which are perhaps part of the same thing at the end. But we started with modeling, you know, we started by modeling, then we moved in to looking at nature as a form of computation with the silkworms, and I'll tell you a little bit about it in a second. And finally, with the Silk Pavilion, we've emerged on the other side of inspiration by utilizing biology itself as a form of fabrication. We tend to mimic biology, and the whole practice of biomimicry entails that we create robotic systems and engineering systems that mimic biology in productive ways. But what if we could actually use biology? What if we could actually utilize some of the biological forms and methods to work not against us, but with us, not against them, but with them, to form a different kind of, again, symbiosis that would end up with a project. In the Silk Pavilion, we deployed 6,500 silkworms to create a dome structure that was made out of 26 polygonal patches that made for the primary structure. And on top of these patches, they were woven using silk thread that provided for the template. And on top of that structure, we deployed those 6,500 silkworms that then wove or spun silk between those silk lines The big discovery for us was that, or the approach that emerged out of that project was that approach of a templated biology, of the fact that we could form a kind of a template, and on top of that template we could deploy nature in its form, in its free form, and achieve an architectural pavilion. So the silkworms were left to metamorphosize naturally on the pavilion without being boiled in their cocoons, but they were left to complete their own metamorphosis cycle on the pavilion, mate, lay eggs, and spin, or spin, mate, and lay eggs, and finally die, and leave this incredible structure, which is made entirely of 100% silk, both the primary and the secondary structure. And we enjoyed that very, very much, and we hope to take that into the next level in the Coral Pavilion.
And I have to put my glasses on for this, because this was about life and death of the silkworm. I mean, we're also dealing with the life and death of reefs, and wanting to create also something about the reef pavilion that dies is a symbol of that, maybe, possibly, if it's not done in the ocean. But how do you use these biological forms to create? How would you create something like that? You were talking about a template that was created for the silk pavilion. What sort of a template would you use to create that life form?
So we don't know exactly. Well, we've went through several thought experiments. At the beginning, of course, we thought, well, let's use coral as our building material, and let's build the entire pavilion underwater. Let's build an artificial reef using biorocks and huge, large-scale biorocks to enrich the coral reefs. Of course, these kind of experiments are being done and contributing to our planet and to our environmental conditions. But then we thought, well, of course, if we can't use coral on land, because it takes tens of thousands of years to grow coral and to grow reefs, and it takes, between 24 hours to 72 hours to spin a silk cocoon. Time scale actually play a huge role here. And so I think now we're at the point where we're asking ourselves, what is the level of translation, or what is the scale of the analogy? Where are we commenting on the state of coral reefs by using bacteria? Are we going to use a different material to begin a kind of a productive conversation about coral reefs? So not using the coral itself as a material, perhaps even not using coral reefs as the kind of morphological inspiration, and completely separating ourselves from corals as material, but looking at corals as a environmental condition and reinterpreting that using another material, say bacteria, or biofilms that are then superimposed on a primary template and let grow as a kind of secondary structure. So it's still unclear to us the level of translation and how direct that translation is in relation to corals. I mean, vernacular architecture is all about is much of vernacular architecture actually is about subtractive processes of taking away from the land. I mean, the first shelter is a cave, right? We start with a rock and we cut through the rock, and we make a home out of that rock. And the primitive hut, in many ways, was that, making a shelter out of trees that create a hut. So this is also true for corals. I mean, process of material sedimentation that are additive processes of adding material one layer on top of the other, plus the erosion of the water through these materials, creating holes and pores and various caves for fish to inhabit, are very much part of architectural practice. Of course, some architects prefer to be thought of as builders, others as diggers, but I think nature does both. Nature grows, it spins, it aggregates, it digs, and all of these processes can find their translation in digital practice through milling and 3D printing and cutting, and we'd love to somehow use the Coral Pavilion to to celebrate an integrative approach to fabrication rather than focus on a particular kind of positive space making approach. So again, that remains to be seen in terms of what tools we're using and how those are tools put together to build something larger than themselves.
You mentioned about the coral reefs having sort of areas and caves that are naturally formed, where these sort of grunting fish use to actually amplify their sound. And we sort of want to bring sound into this conversation a bit, because we've been talking about it for a while, and Jana's here with us, and we've been talking a lot about her take on all of this and what her contribution or her understanding of how sound, which is a very important part of reefs, which I think people don't understand. They've seen lots of pretty pictures of reefs, very few people have heard the reefs, and through hearing reefs you understand actually how much is going on in them.
Yeah.
Much more than you can see, even when you're diving.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so much noise down there that you just wonder what is creating that sound, and actually many people don't even know how to explain what the sound really comes from. But we were talking about either using parts of the shapes of the pavilion to amplify certain sounds that are natural to the environment or occupying that environment, or some sounds might even inform the shapes and the architecture. And how do you imagine that this sound, I know this is very, very early stages, and this is very early that we're just talking about this, but how do you feel this is, I mean, what's your sense of how this is developing?
Yeah, the short of it is that I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
And that I'm really happy
it's a nasty question.
and delightful not to know. And the long answer is that, I mean, I like to think of sound as you know, the relationship between sound and silence is a little bit similar or analogous to the relationship between the positive and negative space in architecture. You have to create or identify a negative space in order to define the positive space. You know, a building does not exist without its environment, and one can think of it as a free sort of as something that stands on its own. So positive space is defined by negative space in as much as sound is defined by silence, and that kind of relationship between the presence and the absence of sound is something that I'm intrigued by. The very fact that coral reefs actually don't produce sound, but they act as resonating chambers, you know, in as much as the great mosque at Isfahan that was handcrafted to lock the sound of the prayers in the building, and then was known to reverberate the sound back to in the mosque as an echo the sound of the prayers, is something that I'm very, very much intrigued by. It even has something mystical to it.
Yeah, definitely.
The corals don't produce sound, but they act as the resonating chambers for this incredible and rich life that it shelters, that it enables through its geometry, through its material existence. And that's just fascinating. How does that relationship exist? So we're not sure. I mean, is the Coral Pavilion a resonating chamber for sound, or is its form generated through the sounds that Jana is recording? Is it a representation of all the sounds that we can collect from around the world, a kind of origin of the species in sound, through the representation of sound, a kind of a treatise and a conversation that we're having with Darwin in 2014? I don't know. But all of these are things that I'm thinking about. You know, what is the acoustical interpretation of the beagle? You know, or the kind of journey that Columbus took. Where are we now? Are we creating a kind of time capsule that will remain to lock the sounds that we can collect today as a kind of an acoustical footprint in 2014 for people, for human beings in 100 years from now to listen to and say, wow, this is what the world consisted of 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, or 10,000 years ago. Is this an acoustical footprint that acts as a kind of time capsule for our culture? That would be incredible if we can achieve a footprint that is both a scientific and engineering feat, but also a cultural footprint that stands there on land as a witness to what life is and was in this year of our celebrating the Coral Pavilion. And I hope that it will be as meaningful in many years from now as it will be for us, you know, in the opening reception. I hope that it will begin a very productive conversation about our relationship with nature, granted not without provocation and not without perhaps conflict, or not without disciplinary friction. The more friction, the better. But something that will be meaningful in various levels, in various scales, scientific, engineering, but also cultural and poetically. That is my ultimate challenge, to sort of link between all those in the creation of our pavilion.
Thank you.